So, David Boonin, what first drew you to philosophy? What was your first encounter with philosophy? What was the first issue? Maybe the first philosopher? What can you um, pick out as your origin story?
Yeah. Well, at the risk of sounding like a philosopher right off the bat, I think there were probably more than one first experience. So, can I give like a
Oh,
multi-part answer?
absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I did have a pretty formative experience during my freshman year in college that I'll get to, but I think there were a couple of things before college that sort of primed me to get hooked on philosophy once I got there. So, the first is my father was a philosophy professor. I don't know if you know this.
I
Len
did not
Boonin
know that.
was also a philosophy professor, also at the University of Colorado at Boulder. So, I grew up in Boulder. In the house of a philosophy professor. I don't think, I mean, looking back on it, I don't really remember talking about philosophy. I don't remember learning philosophical jargon. Probably the only philosophers I could have named would have been, philosophers that any high school student, could have named. And I actually do remember, so I have fairly vivid memories of when I was like a fairly young kid. He would have some colleagues over for dinner, and I remember the experience of not understanding what they were saying and thinking that they were kind of making up words as they went and thinking it was some kind of game, and I didn't quite understand the rules. So in that sense, I don't think I had sort of a head start in philosophy. But looking back on it, I would say I think I was sort of raised in a kind of Socratic household, in the sense that I think we were always encouraged to think further about why we thought something. He was always sort of asking questions. He's still always at if I go to by to visit, almost always the first words out of his mouth are, "Now, David, I have a question." Uh, so in that sense, I think I was kind of primed for philosophy. The other experience. So in high school, a friend of mine and I wanted to join the debate team, but it turned out that our high school didn't have a debate team, and so we started one, but we didn't really sort of fully know what we were doing, and we ended up participating in this form of debate called on-topic cross-examination debate, where there's a topic each year. One year it was like consumer product safety. You were supposed to do a bunch of research, and it was largely kind of evidence based. And then you'd show up, and when you were on the negative side, the other team would present their case, and you were expected to have like facts at your disposal to try to rebut them. And then there'd be these sort of cross examinations, like in a legal case. And we were generally kind of woefully unprepared because we had just done relatively little research, and some of these teams would walk in with like these moving trunks full of evidence cards and so on. So we got pretty good at, the other team would give its case or whatever, and we typically didn't have any evidence we could use, to rebut their claim. That the U.S. government should introduce a new regulation of such and such. I don't know. Are these things dangerous? But we got pretty good at trying to pick holes in. Well, your evidence card said such and such, but then you said such and such. But like, what's the reason for moving from this claim to that claim? Or like, you seem to be generalizing from one case, or that was a case where such and such was true, but this is a case where such and such is. Anyhow. Uh,
So
so
laziness drew you to philosophy, as it does
Yes,
to many people.
laziness and ignorance. Yes, I would say, and a lack of good funding from my high school. Maybe I shouldn't have thrown that
Hey,
last part in. But yeah.
I
So
must use that when we advertise for our major. Are you lazy and ignorant?
yeah,
We're the major
philosophy
for
is
you.
here. Well, yeah, no. So I mean, I have to say, I did find it. I mean, we weren't like super successful, but we did pretty well. Uh, but yeah, it was particularly gratifying to come out of one of those rounds, if we won, anyhow, feeling like they had all these evidence cards and we had hardly any, but like we found holes in what they were saying, and that was enough. And I think. I mean, in retrospect, there was a little bit of blood sport to this form of debate, but I think I was particularly good at the cross examination part where, one of the members of the other team stands up and then you go and you sort of like, again, you try to sort of punch holes in their argument. And then based on their responses, you try to keep it going. And yeah, so I think, having the father as the philosophy professor, always sort of asking questions. And then I do think this experience of seeing that like, you can do stuff and think through positions. I mean, evidence obviously is important, but like there are things you can do that don't require evidence. You can find mistakes in reasoning that people are making and so forth. So I think I was kind of primed in that way. Anyhow, so I got to Yale. My freshman year, I was in this program called Directed Studies, which I think still exists there. So it's a year-long interdisciplinary seminar program. So you have a small seminar in philosophy, a small seminar in literature, a small seminar in history and politics, and they're all kind of integrated. So, when you're doing Plato in the philosophy class, you're doing Homer maybe in the literature class and Herodotus in the history and politics class, or maybe Thucydides. Anyhow, so I went to college planning to be an English major, and my aspiration was sort of to become a journalist. That was kind of my big ideal. But yeah, I think the first stuff we read in the philosophy class, the Protagoras might have been, I don't, we started with some of Plato's dialogues. I'm not sure if the Protagoras was the first one, but we read a couple of short ones and then some chunks of the Republic. And, I think like in a lot of classes, Socrates is this kind of divisive figure, and students either kind of love him or hate him. And I just loved him, and I just thought like, this is great, look at what you can do. I think I wasn't very reflective at the time on what Plato was doing with Socrates. I think I was really just kind of looking at Socrates. And I don't think I was even particularly attuned to this whole notion of Socratic irony. I think I largely took it at face value. Like, look what he's doing. Like, he cares about the truth. He sees that questions are difficult. He asks, the experts, and then he punches holes in their arguments. And
he's Columbo. He's Columbo.
yeah,
That's what I
absolutely.
always
And
used to say. I mean,
I
he's
was,
disheveled. He acts like an
yes,
idiot, and then he
yes.
says,
Just one
but,
more question, man.
yeah,
Yes,
that's right. I'm so
absolutely.
stupid. Just explain it to me. I just
Yes.
have one question. Yeah,
Yeah, actually, I hadn't
unfortunately,
thought about that. Next time someone asks me this question, I'll have to add Columbo to my list of
well, but
rhyming
unfortunately, I used
considerations.
to use that, but none of my students know who the hell that is. So,
Well, I know who he is, and
yeah.
maybe someone listening to this will know. But yes. Anyhow, so yeah, so I think from that point on, I was pretty hooked.
Yeah. He's a secular saint of philosophers, is
Yeah,
Socrates.
yeah, and so I guess I would say, I mean, part of your question, right? So I don't think it was a particular topic. I mean, I think the first paper I wrote was on something in the Republic, but we read a few different, whatever. There was stuff about politics, there was stuff about epistemology. It was really more, I think, the methodology and just the sharpness and the crispness of kind of lining up, uh, here's a question, here's an answer, here's a counterexample, here's some attempt to finesse the counterexample, here's why it doesn't work. Yeah, I was really hooked on that.
It is kind of a superpower, really. I mean, if you hadn't become a philosopher, you would have become Saul Goodman or something.
I know who that is too. I'd like to think I would have become at least a slightly less evil version of
Maybe
Saul
Chuck.
Goodman.
Maybe
Yeah,
his brother
actually, it's
Chuck.
interesting. I mentioned that my father was a philosopher. He previously had practiced law before he went into philosophy, and my brother went into law. So between the two of us, we've kind of got the two angles covered. But
Yeah. My son just graduated from the law school and is coming to work in Colorado.
oh,
So if
excellent.
you need a defense attorney,
Okay.
he might be available.
Well,
Um,
hopefully I won't.
he's a public defender, though, so I hope that you could probably do better. Okay, so what did you write your dissertation on then?
Yeah. Well, when I went to graduate school, my main interests were in history of philosophy. That was really what had kind of gotten me hooked, and a lot of my undergraduate classes were in that area. And so my first year at Pitt, I took a seminar on Hobbes with Peter Mockimer, who was in the History and Philosophy of Science department. So that was a course that really focused primarily, almost exclusively, I guess, on Hobbes' sort of natural philosophy stuff that I wasn't really familiar with. And then my second year, I took a seminar on Hobbes and Rousseau with David Godier. That was really focusing on the ethics and the politics. And I started seeing what I thought were pretty interesting connections between the natural philosophy and the normative philosophy, and seeing places where Hobbes seemed to be explicitly sort of saying that that's how he envisioned what he was doing. That Godier wasn't particularly focusing on. We were really just sort of doing the relevant parts of like Leviathan and a few a few other works. And then I guess at some point around that same time, so Gaudier's book Morals by Agreement had been published fairly recently, and I started thinking that so he had his own, he was also a Hobbes scholar, had his own kind of take on Hobbes, and I started thinking that um, Hobbes's moral theory was actually closer to Gaudier's moral theory than it was to Gaudier's interpretation of Hobbes's moral theory, even though I think Gaudier took himself to be and acknowledged himself to be, influenced by Hobbes. So my dissertation kind of grew out of those two thoughts that the, fundamentally Hobbes was trying to ground a moral philosophy in his natural philosophy. And as with Gaudier's own moral theory, but unlike Gaudier's interpretation of Hobbes's moral theory, there was kind of this foundational thought that you can expect to do better in life if you internalize certain constraints on your behavior. Honesty and promise keeping is kind of like the most straightforward example, and that ultimately what Hobbes thought was there. I think he was more influenced by ancient thoughts about virtue than most people had thought. So the upshot of the dissertation, which became my first book, was that actually Hobbes is best understood as a certain kind of virtue theorist, in some ways not so different from other virtue theories. Virtuous person will flourish if they cultivate certain virtues. Some of the virtues were fairly traditional virtues, things again, sort of like honesty and so forth. But the defense, the grounding of the virtues in flourishing is much more, sort of minimalist and kind of materialist. Like, you'll have a better chance of surviving, right? If you develop a reputation as an honest person, and the best way to develop a reputation as an honest person is to actually be an honest person, and the best way to be an honest person is to actually have kind of come to cultivate the disposition to sort of tell the truth for its own sake, keep your promises because I'm a man of my word, that sort of thing. So that was my dissertation, and then my first book project after I graduated.
Yeah, I didn't write on Hobbes because my dissertation advisor was Sharon Lloyd, and she wrote on Hobbes, and I figured if I wrote on Hobbes, I might disagree with her, and that just wouldn't work. She was not a fan of Gautier. I remember she.
Is that right? Well, I
Yeah,
have to say, David was great to work with, and especially since as I said, like my whole project was really sort of about disagreeing with his interpretation, disagreeing with other interpretations too. But I remember this is a pretty vivid memory from graduate school. So I was up in the graduate student lounge, which was 4 floors above the main department office. And this was during the time that I was writing my dissertation. And a graduate student kind of comes in and says, Gaudier's looking for you. He was like running around the office waving a copy of Leviathan and saying like, does anyone know where Boonin is? And so I kind of like hustle down the stairs, and I'm really nervous that he's going to have like found some passage that just, like does me in or whatever. And like, whatever. But what he was excited about was that he had found a passage that supported my interpretation. And so, and it was one that hadn't actually worked into the draft at that point. So no, he was just a delight to work with. And to me, kind of like the model of the philosopher who, he's developed his own strong views, but like, he's in it for the honest debate. So.
that's great. Now, you're perhaps most well known for writing on abortion.
Yeah.
What first drew you to the topic?
Yeah. Well, okay. So that's an interesting question. I remember pretty vividly not becoming aware of the fact that I didn't have an opinion about abortion. This was something during my first year in graduate school, and a group of us were walking. I don't know, someplace on campus, and somebody was passing around a petition, a sort of pro-choice petition asking for signatures, and all my friends signed it. And I found myself thinking, I don't really know that I want to sign. Like, I don't find this obvious. Like, I haven't really thought much about it, but I had become a vegetarian my senior year in college. So, I was kind of at least open to the thought that, like, beings that maybe people don't think of as having moral status, maybe it turns out that they do, and maybe like that's enough to make certain things wrong. So I was agnostic, I think, And I became sort of aware that like I really hadn't thought much about it. Anyhow, so I kind of suspect that would have continued to be the case for some time. But my second year in grad school, I was TAing for a political philosophy course. It was kind of history of political philosophy. Tamara Horowitz was the teacher, and I think it was Rousseau. She was lecturing on Rousseau, and here's something Rousseau said about rights or whatever. And then she sort of said, as an aside or sort of an example, I don't remember exactly, but she just gave kind of like a 30-second summary of Judith Thompson's argument in her article called "A Defense of Abortion," which I had never encountered. And I think she just sort of said, there I don't and again I don't remember what the connection with Rousseau was supposed to be, but again it was really just kind of an aside. Well, you imagine yourself in this situation. You wake up in a hospital and you find that there's this violinist who mysteriously has become bodily connected to you, and they need to use your body for 9 months to go on living. And Thompson says, surely the violinist has a right to life, but that doesn't give him a right to use your body. So the right to life is not the same thing as the right to use another person's body. And she says, so Thompson uses that to argue that abortion is permissible. She says something to connect it to Rousseau, and then she goes back and keeps talking about Rousseau. And I remember just sort of sitting there thinking like, I guess it turns out abortion is permissible after all. So to me, it was kind of a light bulb moment. It was like, oh yeah, there's a difference between the right to life and the right to be kept alive, and the right to use someone else's body. And I hadn't previously thought about that, but that thought experiment convinces me that that's true. And now that I can see that it's true, you can just bypass this whole debate about whether the fetus is a person or whether it has a right to life. Like, all you need, maybe if you just see a fetus sitting on the street, you shouldn't like shoot it in the head or something. But all you need to know, to resolve the abortion issue is, even if it has the right to life, that doesn't give it the right to use a pregnant woman's body. And so if she doesn't want to let the fetus use her body, that's her right. And, end of story. So yeah, it was kind of a light bulb moment. And I became interested in the issue, not because of the issue, but because of the argument. And that's been true about pretty much everything I've written on. I've almost never gotten interested in a topic first and then thought, let's find out what the arguments are about this topic. It's almost always been, I encounter some argument, and I think, wow, that's a weird argument, or, oh, that seems like a good argument, or that's a puzzling argument. And then, it takes place in some context, and then I just sort of go.
That's kind of strange because you write so much about the kind of topics you write on topics that are people get very excised about. That are
Well,
like
yeah.
racism, abortion, punishment, all of these things that people are crusaders about, and it's interesting that you're sort of above the fray, just dissecting
Well,
the arguments.
yeah. I mean, I don't know if I want to say I'm above the fray, but I guess I would say um, there are topics that I think are important social issues that, at least so far, where I haven't really seen like interesting philosophical arguments or issues. Maybe because some of them do turn more heavily on empirical assumptions or whatever. So no, I mean, I tend to want to read around on issues, that I think students will be interested in, and so right, typically there's something kind of socially interesting about the subject. But as far as what I end up writing about, it's almost always like discovering an argument first, and then that sort of driving the horse. So horse, I don't know, driving the story. Anyhow, so I got to Georgetown. I had a 1 year job at Georgetown that turned over for a second year. That was when I finished turning my dissertation into a book. And in the meantime, I'd been teaching these intro ethics courses that were about 12 or 13 weeks of sort of history of philosophy, and then a little bit of applied ethics at the end. And each time it was like so many more students kind of got energized and started talking when we got to the applied ethics stuff. And so it was right around the time that I was finishing the Hobbes project. I sort of felt like I want my research to be in alignment with my teaching, but I'd like to do a lot more teaching in this applied ethics area. And I remembered the Thompson article, and I think by that point I had read, excuse me, Don Marquis's piece. And so, yeah, I don't know. It was kind of a little reckless, I think. I had no particular reason to think I could write a book about abortion, but I hadn't really studied it or whatever. But I just thought, like, I'm going to pivot away from history and into applied ethics, and abortion was the main project that I worked on then.
Do you think your analysis of McFall versus Shimp, the court case that you use in your first book on abortion, and in particular in this one,
Yeah,
has influenced anybody? Because it seems like the debate. Well, it seems
yeah,
like Thompson would have good reason to throw up her hands and say, was nobody listening? Because the debate still is, life begins at conception. That's all that people fixate upon. And she said, look, move past that. You're ignoring the rights of another person. I mean, that is the great thing about the violinist case. As she says at the beginning, women have been saying it's my body. You're ignoring that point. You seem to think that the only thing that is worth discussing is whether or not the fetus is a person, but you're forgetting that the fetus is located inside somebody who has rights. And let's see how these rights affect whether or not abortion should be permissible. And as you say, this case McFall versus Shimp seems to, but certainly what the judge said in the decision seems to very much support this idea that, well, I always thought the kind of genius of Thompson's article is it sets two conservative intuitions off against each other. There's the
hmm
anti-abortion view, but then there's the libertarian view of, my body, which we saw in full flower in the masking uh,
yeah.
debate. Clearly that is a strain that has not gone away, and if anything, it's gotten more intense. And yet, nobody picks up on this. Nobody even tries to engage with Thompson, except maybe Christopher Kazor and a few Catholic writers. But it hasn't entered the mainstream.
I think that's largely true. So my hope, right. So a defense abortion, is written in a pretty standardly academic style. There's lots of footnotes. There's a fair amount of jargon. There's a lot of like, here's 10 responses to this objection, and here's 7 objections to this response, and so forth. And covers a lot of ground besides just the stuff about Thompson. I mean, my aspiration with the Beyond Roe book was to write something more accessible to undergraduates, general readers, and so forth.
You certainly timed it well.
Things. Yeah, I guess that's one way of putting it. Anyhow, so I'm sorry. Right. So I guess I was going to say 2 things. So one is right. So in teaching Thompson's argument over the years. And I'm sure lots of other people who've taught Thompson's argument have had the same experience. Just the weirdness of the violinist case, I think, kind of gets in the way of a lot of discussion, or maybe even kind of like a fair hearing.
Let alone the people seeds and the giant.
I don't even touch the people seeds, and no one knows who Henry Fonda is. I mean, if they don't know Columbo, they certainly aren't going to know Henry Fonda.
12 Angry Men. Actually, I taught Thompson last semester to a bunch of high school kids, and they were all wearing sweatshirts called for their production of 12 Angry Jurors, because you can't call it 12 Angry Men anymore. And I said,
okay.
Henry Fonda in the best movie version of
Oh,
that.
nice. Yeah. Well, I think, I don't know whether more recently, I think Jane Fonda, for many years, then you could have said, well, he was Jane Fonda's father, and then the students don't know who Jane Fonda
Even
is.
Bridget Fonda vanished.
I was going to say, yes, there was a very brief period where you could say Bridget Fonda. Anyway, Jane Fonda's having a bit of a revival. In any event, so I guess what I was going to say was, at some point when I was working on the Defense of Abortion book, when I came across the McFall-Shimp reference, I'm certainly not the first person to have made the connection to Thompson's argument. And I guess for people who were watching this or whatever, so McFall gets sick and needs bone marrow, and the evidence seems to be that his cousin Shimp is the only person who can provide it. And then Shimp initially seems to agree, and then he backs out, and McFall is going to die, and so he tries to get an injunction from the courts to force Shimp to let McFall have some of his bone marrow. And yeah, the judge sort of says, in so many words, this is ridiculous. Like, this is just
I
not the
like
kind
the
of thing that you can
vampire
do.
analogy that he
Yeah,
uses.
yeah. There's quite a bit of emotive wording, some reference, I think, at least indirectly to the Nazis and so forth. In any event, it's a clear, concrete case. It's a real life case, and right. And anyone who has the intuition that you'd have the right to unplug yourself from Thompson's violinist is going to have the intuition that Shimp had the right. It was selfish of him, whatever, but like morally speaking, he's within his rights if he doesn't want to let McFall use his bone marrow. So I started using that example in teaching, and I participated in a handful of public debates, and I started using that example instead of the violinist example. And yeah, I guess my experience, at least in teaching, is McFall versus Shimp helps to ground the argument in a case that doesn't get them worried about some of these questions about super science fiction thought experiments and so forth. Uh, and so, right. So a big motivation behind the Beyond Row book was to, in a sense, um, represent Thompson's argument in terms of the legal right rather than the moral right, using McFall versus Shimp, but then also to address a bunch of questions that I don't think Thompson, at least directly, really addressed at all, which would be questions about sort of abortion restrictions. So even if you agree that you should have the right to unplug yourself or the right not to give someone bone marrow, might there still be various sorts of restrictions that would be justified? And I became sort of interested in thinking that through. But to get back to your original question, has it had any impact outside of the students in my class or whatever? I've gotten a handful of emails from people who've read the book and said that they found it pretty powerful. I've also gotten emails from people who have objections and they want to hear from me, and I write back and tell them what I think. So yeah, probably a tiny little bit of impact, but that's
It is
what else can you
strange.
do?
It is strange that that just seems to. I mean, in philosophical circles, Thompson's article is, one of the big articles of the
Yeah,
20th century, but
yeah.
it just
I,
hasn't. We haven't moved past the debate about,
yeah, I,
or at least, even if you think that she can't avoid the topic of whether or not the fetus is a person, at least you have to respond to her, but people
yeah,
just ignore it.
yeah. So maybe I shouldn't say this, but well, whatever. No, I think I haven't looked at the recent Supreme Court ruling, but several days after it came out, a friend of mine sent me. I guess they had sort of gone through it, and they sent me a list, or at least a partial list, of the philosophers, or the pro-choice, I guess you could say, philosophers who are referred to or footnoted, in the opinion, and made a point of saying, no references to Boonin. So no, if I was writing with the hope of influencing the Supreme Court, which I suppose in my dreams maybe I was in part doing, but no, that certainly did not happen.
Oh well.
Yep, I maybe
Uh,
third time is the charm. I've written 2 books on abortion. Maybe I'll try one more.
Listen up, people. You should call the third one or something like that. Um, okay. You have so many books that I'm gonna move on and ask you about. In the problem of punishment,
Yeah.
another one of your books, you defend the claim that it is morally impermissible for the state to punish people for breaking the law. That sounds pretty radical. Say something about that.
Okay. Um, well, let's see. Say something about that. Yeah, I guess I'll say a couple of things. So, part of the purpose of the book is to get the reader to think that there is a problem where they might not initially think there's a problem. And the way I think of the problem is in terms of a general practice. So at the level of we so assume that we have a bunch of just and reasonable laws, assume we have a bunch of just and reasonable procedures for deciding which people have broken the laws, which people haven't. We draw this line between the people who've broken the laws and the people who haven't, and we treat that line itself as morally relevant in a very particular way. everybody on the offender side of the line, it becomes permissible not just to do things that are very harmful to them, but to do things in order to harm them. Like that's the point of doing these things. And these are things that we don't ordinarily think it's okay for governments to do. So when I say it's not morally permissible for the state to punish people for breaking the law, um, uh, I, the claim is that you frame the problem in terms of what's the justification for treating this particular line as a morally relevant line, and then in the book I sort of go through kind of consequentialist responses, various forms of retributivist responses, other kinds of responses, moral education theories, social communication theories, self-defense theories, and so forth. And the conclusion I reach is that in each of those cases, I mean, typically there's a variety of sort of problems. But one problem that I think comes up pretty much over and over again is they end up being over inclusive and typically also sort of under inclusive. So they end up justifying inflicting this suffering not just on the people on the offender side of the line, but at least some people on the non-offender side of the line. That typically also they have difficulty explaining why everyone on the offender side of the line it's permissible to punish them. And so, right. So the claim that the practice is impermissible is the claim that you know the mere fact that someone has broken a just and reasonable law by itself doesn't provide a rationale for intentionally harming them. So, I mean, I guess in a sense, all I've maybe done is kind of articulate what the thesis is, but I've tried to sort of build in what some of the motivation was. Once you come to sort of see punishment as an institution that stands in need of justification, it seems to me the kind of justification that it requires is precisely the kind that would show that there's a morally relevant difference between everyone on one side of that line and everyone on the other. And I think it turns out that there isn't.
My wife, who I met in graduate school, wrote her dissertation on punishment, and she designed a perfect class on the philosophy of punishment, and then she got a job. We were grad students at USC in Los Angeles, and she got a job in Arkansas, and then I had to take over teaching the class. And I remember there were some disgruntled students. But one thing that I did get out of this is Clockwork Orange is a great work if you are a retributivist, because the argument of Clockwork Orange is that the punishment, Ludovico's technique, well, it's not punishment, the Ludovico's technique, which is the method by which Alex, the anti-hero, is made incapable of violence. Famously in the movie, they prop his eyes open and make him watch movies, and the downside for him is he loves Beethoven, and they play Beethoven as they show movies of Nazi atrocities and inject him so he feels sick. So it succeeds. It makes him no longer a criminal, but the clear message of the book is that this is monstrous and that you cannot do this. And in fact, punishing him in a way that is just standard punishment, imprisoning him in a pretty brutal prison system, is better than that. Because, it's a Kantian line, I assume, respect for his free will. So what do you say to the retributivist who says, on the contrary, the alternatives to punishment, if we had this method of making criminals into good people, we still shouldn't do that, because that, in some sense, does not respect their autonomy?
Yeah, I mean, boy, there's a lot going on in that question. I guess I'll say two things. So, right. So the first is there are different versions of retributivism. There's kind of these sort of basic sort of desert-based versions of retributivism. There's these kind of like fairness-based versions of retributivism. And they might have different things to say about some of these cases. I don't know. In my book, I think I primarily, when I'm critiquing these views, again, trying to show that the views have implications that even proponents of the views themselves don't accept. So again, it's kind of my Socratic instinct. But as far as this question of what the alternative is and what would be better, yeah. So as I recall, I'm not quite sure about this. I don't think the language of restorative justice was already sort of around, but at the time I was writing the book, but I don't think it made it into the book. So I put it in terms of restitution. But right in the last chapter, I addressed the question, if we can't have punishment, what are we allowed to do? And I focus on victim restitution as an example of something that I think we can do. And in the case of violent criminals who do pose a danger to society, and if there really isn't an autonomy respecting way of helping them to make themselves better, like drug rehabilitation or something like this, then I say, there may well be cases, maybe a number of cases, where we're entitled to protect ourselves from them by locking them up. So we do that with people who are found to be criminally insane, if they're found to be a danger to themselves or to society. But we don't take it that we're punishing them, precisely because we don't take it that we're doing something in order to harm them, right? So I taught this course on punishment for several years while I was working on the book, and so like the first many weeks or whatever, I'd be like, I'm anti-punishment, and I'm going to shoot down this theory and shoot down that theory. And then we'd get to the end, and like often a lot of the students were really disappointed when I was like, oh yeah, I still think it's okay to lock people up, but it's not okay. It's just not okay to punish them. But I guess I'd say a couple of things. So one is, so in purely theoretical terms, right? If it turns out that my form, at least, of punishment abolitionism is still consistent with locking up people who are a danger to society, then as long as you're doing it in a way that doesn't involve doing it in order to harm them, right? Again, as we do, a quarantine would be another sort of case. So if somebody really is highly contagious with a highly infectious and extremely dangerous disease, I think most people take it that it can be permissible to impose quarantine on them.
Well,
Yeah.
what
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So all right. I'll say a couple things about that, and then I'll try to back up. So first of all, I did say most people. No, but look, I suspect, I could be wrong, but I suspect that most people who would be opposed to mandatory quarantine in the COVID case, it would be because they're skeptical about whether COVID really is so dangerous or whether it really is so contagious. But I think if you stipulated a case where it just was very clear, everybody who gets within 100 feet of this person just drops dead within 24 hours or whatever, we'd be entitled to prevent that person from getting within 100 feet of us, in my view. In any event, on the assumption that people accept that, right, then again, or again, in the case of people who are found not guilty of a violent crime, by grounds of insanity or something, I think most people are okay with the idea that even though we don't hold them culpable and so we're not punishing them, it is permissible for us to confine them. But okay, so sorry. So to back up, you got me a little distracted there. So part of what I want to say is right. So at a theoretical level, if it turns out that my position ends up, in a certain sense, being not so different, at least with respect to violent criminals, from the practice that people were looking to defend, then that can be a good thing, right? So we can say, look, you don't need punishment to get the thing that you thought what you really wanted, which was sort of like protection from violent criminals. But then in all sorts of other cases, locking people up won't turn out to be justified at all. But the other thing, and I do feel like when we had time to kind of go through this in class, I think it did resonate with most people, is there are all sorts of differences between, at least in principle, the way we treat people when we put them in a prison and the way we treat people when we unfortunately have to confine them because of quarantine or because of mental illness or something like that. So there's all sorts of enjoyments that we deliberately deprive people of in prison because part of the point is we want them to be miserable there, right? And there would be no reason to do that if the only reason that we were confining them was to protect ourselves. So I do think there would actually be pretty substantial practical differences between what sort of incarceration would look like under a non-punitive regime and what it looks like under a punitive regime. And so, in that sense, I think that it's not such a trivial difference. But at the same time, to get back to the original point, I think of your question, I think it gives a fine answer to the retributivist, right? We don't have to lock people up under nasty conditions and make them suffer in order to protect ourselves. Maybe that's something we'd have to do if we thought the state had the right to make sure everybody gets what they deserve. But I don't think on reflection we think that.
Yeah, I'm thinking of another 70s movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, because
Okay.
once you have a model where you say, I'm not punishing you, I'm doing this for the good of society or something like that, then you're no longer, you're presented more as, it's easy to view you as a patient or as, in some senses, also a disease. And
Okay.
then you can be dehumanized in that respect. I mean, sure, prison is dehumanizing, but at the same time, you have the right to an attorney, you have a right to a parole hearing, these kind of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
Whereas if you are being put there because you're a danger to society, well, maybe if there's a method by which you can prove that you cease to be a danger, but that is notoriously difficult, and it's kind of an open-ended sentence. So it could be that somebody has committed one minor felony, but they decided, well, we just were lucky to catch them early, and in fact, this person is a psychopath, and therefore nothing would prevent them from doing monstrous things. They could be imprisoned for a long, an indefinite period, whereas, or they could be confined for an indefinite period. Whereas, somebody who committed an atrocity, but at some sense could show, oh, that was a one-off thing, that was something that was temporary. Then it looks like the proportionality principle would be at risk.
Um,
I
yeah, I'm
think
not
that
sure about.
sorry,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
that's what retributivists tend to push. That they're the only ones who can really account for proportionality of punishment.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I'm not quite sure what to say because I mean the line of argument that I think you're sketching is kind of a consequentialist, sort of if we give the state the authority to make decisions of this sort, uh, it's maybe sufficiently likely that this will encourage them to view these offenders, as patients or in some sort of dehumanizing way, and then as a result to mistreat them in one way or another. Um, and I think that might all turn out to be true. But I think that's also true, arguably more true, if you give the state, authorize the state to treat these people as people who deserve to suffer,
Right.
for what they did. So, the retributivist theorist, I don't know. I'm a little reluctant to give a well. Okay, I don't know. Pick a case like physical assault or sexual assault or blackmail or something. I don't know. At least the desert-based retributivist, they're gonna sort of say, well, in principle, right? This person should be made to suffer, in a manner and to a degree that's proportionate to the suffering that they inflicted on their victim or victims. So they can say that, and then in some sense, they can just make it true by definition that proportionality will be respected. But again, if we're going to have sort of an apples to apples comparison, and if when we're looking at the restitution view, we're kind of looking at it more kind of from like a realpolitik, like what's actually going to happen point of view, then I think we would say the same thing. If you give the state or the judges the authority to make decisions about how to treat people based on their you know intuition about how much suffering this person deserves, I think you can get equally serious, if not more serious consequences. On the other hand, if you make an apples to apples comparison by keeping them both kind of at the theory level as opposed to at the real world level, then yeah, I mean, I guess, I mean, I suppose one way of putting it is that, on the non-punitive approach, proportionality, I guess it's more like in self-defense cases, right? So it's not a matter of how bad is this person, how bad is their character. It's how significant is the threat that we're protecting ourselves from, and what can we do to mitigate it, and so forth. Right. In practical terms, it's going to be difficult to distinguish between the person who's been rehabilitated and the person who hasn't. But again, that's true on any kind of rationale for a criminal justice system. But in principle, the view that says, if there are cases where we really feel that we've tried every, humane, autonomy respecting intervention, and all the evidence just points in the direction that this person is going to keep doing this, Hannibal Lecter or something like this, then yeah, it's regrettable, but I don't see. Sorry. Let me restart the sentence. I guess I want to say two things. The first is, and this is maybe the more important, the arguments that I make against punishment do not commit us to saying we're not allowed to keep this person confined. Okay, because the arguments against punishment are all arguments against the intentional infliction of harm, and that's not what's going on here. I guess the second thing is I'm inclined to say, and that would be okay to do under those circumstances, right? If there's someone else who thinks that wouldn't be okay either, then I think the upshot of my position would be, we shouldn't have punishment, and we shouldn't even have, preventive detention. That's not my view, but that would be a possible view.
I remember when I was a kid, there was a comic called 2000 AD in England. The most famous character in this is Judge Dredd, and they made a movie of him fairly recently. Well, I guess 10 years ago at least.
Recently by our standards.
Yes, yeah. That's right. But one of the things that I thought was kind of intriguing about this is they had a system where they, instead of imprisoning people, they had machines that aged you. So they put you in the chair and they pressed the button and they aged you by 10 years, and that was your sentence. So you served your sentence by just losing 10 years. But that wouldn't really give you much time to think about your crimes.
Yeah, so a moral education theorist would definitely oppose that. But yeah, I guess, yeah, that's interesting. If it didn't involve any suffering, yeah, I mean, it's still
Judge Dredd was not supposed to be ideas that we copied. He's supposed to be kind of a future fascist. But
yeah. I think the retributivists might have to say that's an improvement over the current system. Yeah.
Okay, moving on to another book. How about this one?
This is going to get a bit exhausting, but yeah, go ahead. Okay.
Well, it's your own fault for writing so many books.
Yeah.
Could you, for those unfamiliar with it, could you explain the non-identity problem, why it is so important, and what is so novel about your approach to it?
Yeah, so the non-identity problem, I think the easiest way to approach it is through a particular example. Maybe I'll start with, this is the example I mentioned in the preface to the book. So I read about this one. During the time I was working on the book, New York City came out with a series of public service ads that were designed to try to discourage teenage pregnancy. And so I read about it because they ended up being controversial for reasons that are not relevant to the non-identity problem. But anyhow, so one of them, it's a picture like a big sort of billboard, or a subway ad. So there's this little boy, like a little toddler, and I think, as I recall, like he's literally crying. Either way, he's got these very sad eyes. And the wording says something to the effect of, my chances of dropping out of high school are twice as great because you had me as a teenager. So he's kind of, Jacques Hughes, to the teenage mom. Right. So the idea is supposed to be, there's apparently a lot of statistical evidence that on average, people who are born to teen mothers, teen parents, but the mother is the one who gets the blame here, do less well in life by all sorts of relatively uncontroversial measures of human well-being. And so when you see this ad, you're supposed to think, oh, this poor little boy, he's been victimized by his mother. If only she had waited 10 years, finished high
Maybe she
school,
had chosen not to
gone to
exist.
college, gotten a good job before she had him, then his chances of success in life would be much greater, right? And so that's why shame on you. You shouldn't become a teenage mom. Okay, so what I like about that example, I think, because of the sort of bigger time gap, like it should become pretty clear as soon as you start thinking about that example. Well, wait a minute, like if she waited 10 years before conceiving, she wasn't going to have that kid, right? She would have just had some other kid, and that other kid would have had a great chance of graduating from high school, right? So not only did her having this kid as a teenager not reduce his chances of graduating from high school, but really the only way you could possibly graduate from high school would be if she conceived as a teenager. Because 10 years later it would have been a different sperm, a different egg, so we think a different person would have been brought into existence, and that's where the non-identity part gets its the non-identity part of the non-identity problem comes in. Right. So the idea is many people, at least in the case of the teenage mother, have a pretty strong intuition that it's wrong for you to conceive a child at such a young age, at least given these empirical assumptions about how much harder that's going to make it for your child. But once you see that, right, if she had waited 10 years, it's not like that would have made things better for this kid. This kid just wouldn't have existed, right? And it still seems like he gets a life it's worth living. It's just not like as good as the life that this other kid would have had. Then you ought to be led to the view that she hasn't really harmed her child, which really the message that this billboard was clearly trying to convey is like, she's harmed this child. That's why he's so sad, right? Because his chances of making it through high school have been so greatly reduced. But it seems like no, because of this non-identity feature of the case, she hasn't harmed him. And there's no particular reason to think she's harmed anyone else. So it kind of seems like on reflection, her act hasn't harmed anyone. But then you can join that claim with what seems to be a pretty common, widespread element of sort of what I guess I refer to as sort of common sense moral thinking, the sort of no harm, no foul view. If my act doesn't harm you, it doesn't wrong you. If it doesn't wrong anyone, then it's just not wrong. Sort of full stop. Then it seems like her act isn't wrong. So that's one kind of example of the non-identity problem. You can spell it out a little bit more formally. You've got a set of assumptions that yield this conclusion. Her act didn't make the kid worse off, but if it had harmed the kid, the act would have made the kid worse off. So the act didn't harm the kid, didn't harm anyone else. And that doesn't harm anyone. It doesn't wrong anyone. If it doesn't wrong anyone, then it's not wrong. So the act's not wrong. Okay, so that's one sort of example. As far as the significance of the problem, once you start focusing on how fragile the circumstances of conception are, you start seeing this problem in all sorts of contexts. Okay, so common arguments against incest, at least heterosexual procreative, incest is, increases the risks of various sorts of genetic abnormalities. But again, it's not as if, if a brother and sister, conceive a child and the child ends up with some kind of genetic problem. It's not as if that kid would have been better off if they had conceived with other people. That kid wouldn't have existed. Virtually every argument against developing reproductive human cloning technology also depends on the claim in one way or another that producing a child by cloning would harm the clone, either by causing physical problems, psychological problems, social problems, and so forth. All of those arguments go out the window if this non-identity problem remains unresolved. And then there are sort of like social level versions of the non-identity problem. So climate change is kind of a common example that people sort of refer to. I mean, if a society at a large scale is choosing between two different policies and one would make things considerably better in the far future than the other, it's quite plausible that the choice between the two is going to have an impact on who meets who in the future, who pairs up with who in the future, who conceives when, and so forth, so that eventually you're just going to have two different populations of people in the future. and then you get this same sort of potential problem. And then one other area that I'll mention, I mean, there are others too, but arguments about reparations for historical injustice, often, or many of them anyhow, can also potentially be undermined by this problem. So slave reparations, I think, is kind of a classic case. So at least on some arguments in defense of slave reparations, the contemporary Black American is said to have been harmed by the institution of slavery. But at least in the case where they're a descendant of slaves, it's pretty plausible to think that if slavery hadn't existed, they never would have been conceived. Like some pair of ancestors at some point was brought together by this institution, and had that institution not existed, those ancestors wouldn't have come together and so forth. So that's an identity problem. That's the significance of it. Plus, I just think it's intrinsically interesting, even if it didn't have all these potentially significant implications. Yeah, and then as far as what's distinctive about my position, I mean, basically what I do in the book is, so in the first chapter, I sort of outline the problem, and I defend three sort of requirements that I think a successful solution to the problem has to have. And basically it amounts to saying, you've got like these five premises that each initially seem plausible. They seem to yield this implausible conclusion. If you're going to solve the problem by avoiding this conclusion, you need to pick a premise, give a reason for rejecting it that's not ad hoc. There's some sort of independent reason for rejecting it. The reason for rejecting it has to be sort of strong enough that I can't just tinker with the argument to get around the counterexample and then still get you to the conclusion of the non-identity argument. But it can't be so strong that it avoids that implication, but then commits you to other implications that are even more problematic than that. So basically what I do in the next, I guess it's 5 chapters then, is sort of one by one, I go through the 5 premises that generate the problem. And in each case, I consider solutions that people have offered where they try to show, here's which premise you should reject, here's what's wrong with it. And I try to show in each case that at least one, usually more than one of these requirements is not satisfied. And typically the problem is, often the problem is you can just revise it, one of the premises, get around the problem, but the revised premise still does the work of getting you to the seemingly implausible conclusion. Other times the problem, I think, is that it commits you to even more implausible implications. And then in the last chapter, and then this is what's distinctive about my position, not unique, a couple of other people have taken roughly the same view, is that essentially we just bite the bullet and accept the implication. And what I try to do that I think is distinctive in the last chapter is I try to give some cases to sort of massage your intuition so that it ends up not seeming so obvious to you that the act was wrong in the cases that generated the problem. But that's definitely what's most distinctive about my view.
Have you read anything about ectogenesis?
Ectogenesis, yeah. I feel like that's is that development of a new person without fertilization, or no?
What it means, there was a bunch of articles of varying quality in Bioethics, the journal Bioethics recently, and what they mean by it is removing an embryo or fetus and having it, so basically artificial wombs, having the fetus, so like in Brave New World, I guess.
Okay, yeah.
Because it first came up because I don't know if it was Peter Singer first, but somebody suggested that this would be a solution to the abortion. This would be cutting the abortion Gordian knot, because it would be basically getting what abortion gets for the mother without killing the fetus. And what they discovered is that both sides hated it. Instead of being a solution, both sides hated it.
Well, I think you may have just given me the idea for my 3rd abortion book then, because
so what the debate has turned into is people do talk about whether or not in ectogenesis the mother, the parent has or both parents together has the right to kill the fetus once given the possibility of ectogenesis, does this mean that abortion should no longer be allowed because you don't have to kill the fetus to get rid of the fetus? Now, this is assuming all sorts of things. Presumably, there was I don't know if you are on the internet a lot, but there was a meme of two people. They actually legitimately said this. Two very white people who were sort of looking like this, and they said, "We will adopt your baby."
Yeah.
And I think the coach of the University of Michigan football team said, me and my wife, if you're thinking of having an abortion, we'll adopt your kid. And it was like, this is kind of this is outrageous. But what occurred to me about this ectogenesis debate is because there's this back and forth, and one of the people arguing against having the right to kill the fetus is predictably Christopher Kaiser, who cites you as having read his book and given him comments on it. I don't think they changed his conclusions, but it was good of you to give them.
Well, yeah.
But it occurs to me that this is assuming that the process of gestation cannot be paused. Whereas
Right.
if we've got this, supposing we've got this technology of ectogestation, which apparently they've developed a crude version for donkey fetuses or something, a biobag they call it. Well, presumably we'll have also developed. I'm suggesting we'll have also developed better freezing techniques, just as we can freeze embryos or freeze zygotes at least. Maybe we'll be able to put embryos in suspended animation. And if we did that, if we could do that, then I would say that, what would happen is you would remove the embryo, and then there would be a custody battle that could go on, and you could, fight this in the courts while it was frozen. And it suddenly occurred to me that maybe this is a solution to the non-identity problem. So you can conceive the child when you're a teenager, but it doesn't have to be born then. So it would be the same kid if you
yes.
removed it.
I have to admit, I was waiting to see how this was going to tie back to the non-identity problem. I think that that might be the kind of solution that, as you said, makes nobody happy, and that's usually a good reason for a philosopher to defend it. Actually, as you were speaking, though, I guess I was thinking of another case that I didn't mention where this kind of thing, I think, wouldn't happily work. So this is cases where a deaf couple is using IVF and they wish to select in favor of gestating the embryo that will become a deaf child. And so many people have the intuition on the assumption, which obviously not everybody shares, but on the assumption that deafness impairs a person's quality of life in some non-trivial manner. Many people have the intuition that it's wrong for the deaf couple to do that. And obviously that's a case where it doesn't matter how long it's frozen before it's brought to term. If it's such that genetically it's going to be deaf, it's going to be deaf. And then that's another one. To be honest, that was one of the cases where biting the bullet didn't seem so difficult to me. But where most solutions to the non-identity problem will try to, in one way or another, get you the result that they do actually harm the child, even though the child isn't worse off than it would otherwise have been, or that they wrong the child, even if they don't harm the child, or that the act is wrong in some non-person affecting way. And then my response is, look, it just turns out that it isn't wrong, and it isn't wrong essentially because. Oh, sorry, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, hasn't this the argument that sort of assumes the non-identity problem been used in court in wrongful life suits?
Yes, it has. In fact, I remember you asked earlier if I'm on the internet much, and I think the answer is probably at least somewhat more than I should be. There was a case that came out. I won't be able to, off the top of my head, remember now, but there was a case in the last year or so someone brought to my attention. I believe it was in England, but I'm not sure. And yeah, what was striking was, let's see, it had to do with someone who was conceived with yeah, some sort of genetic condition, I believe. I don't remember what. But in any event, what was kind of striking was, right, the judge found sort of in favor. I believe it was a woman who was suing either her mother or the doctor for not having kind of like averted the, the birth or something. And what was striking was that the judge's comments, as I recall, explicitly acknowledged, this non-identity feature of the case, that, uh, the woman not conceived, this person wouldn't have existed at all. And the judge didn't seem to be saying, I don't really remember the particular condition, but the judge didn't seem to be saying, like, this condition is so horrible that they're stuck with a life that's like worse than no life at all. I mean, there might be such conditions, but it was nothing like that. So yeah, it does come up in cases, and it seems to me that they just don't see the non-identity problem, rather than that they have their own kind of distinctive solution to it. It seems to be, yeah.
And then, of course, there's David Benatar's position that better never to have been.
Yes.
I don't know what to think about that. It sounds like somebody needed to revive Schopenhauer, and it was he decided it would be him.
Well, I think that's a great book. I happen to have been one of the referees for the manuscript, and I was completely unfamiliar with antinatalism and hadn't really read any of Benatar's work, part of them. And I was pretty taken by it, I guess I would say. So I think it's quite an intriguing argument. I do have a published response. It's a little bit detailed, and I'm not sure I could sort of pull enough of it off the top of my head, but I have a great deal of respect for that book, and I'm not convinced, but I don't think it's making any kind of like simple-minded mistakes. So
I remember I taught a few years ago. I was teaching I got to teach a seminar, and one of the students got to pick different things to read, and the kid that read that just had this visceral hate reaction to this argument, and I was kind of surprised that it produced this response in him, because this was kind of a slacker kid, This was a kid who was kind of drifting through life, and it was like, no, how dare you say that life is not worth living? It's like, well, I have to say, Dustin, I kind of think your life isn't really that worth living.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. I've taught it a couple of times at the graduate level, and maybe at the upper divisional undergraduate level. Excuse me. Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't remember if I've taught it in an intro level course. So I haven't really had that experience. I've certainly had the experience of students thinking that it's obviously wrong, and many of them think that it's obvious that his argument commits him to the conclusion that you should kill yourself. And I think it's quite clear that it doesn't, although it takes a little bit of time to go through that. So, yeah, my experience is more, a number of people found it sort of irritating. I think people students who already anticipate that they would like to have children, I think can take it personally also, in a way that not that much else that we assign tends to do.
Well, talking of arguments that people think are an encouragement to kill yourself, I am sympathetic to the Epicurean view on death. Clearly, given your stated aim in your 2019 book, Dead Wrong, you are not. Convince me.
Well, let's back up a minute. So, what do you mean by the Epicurean view of death?
That death is not a harm to me.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't know. Let's see. Let me think for a minute.
And I assume I will assume that implies that you cannot harm the dead. Let's put it that way.
Okay. So I guess, all right. So then I guess that's the part that I would challenge. Right. So I'm pretty sure that the argument in the book is neutral with respect to the question of whether death harms you. Yeah, because in the same way, so again, this is not meant to be the whole argument, but I suppose just as a quick sort of analogy, I don't think falling asleep harms you. I don't think you're harmed while you're asleep. but I think things can happen while you're asleep that are a harm for you, even if they never impinge on any of your conscious experiences. So I think if a peeping Tom were peeping on you while you were asleep, if you were naked or whatever, and even if you never found out about it, I think that could make your life go worse. But that certainly doesn't commit you to saying that like sleep is a harm. So in roughly the same way, then I guess I would say the same thing about death. So the main argument that's supposed to motivate the view that posthumous harm is not possible is, like once you're dead, nothing can impinge on any of your conscious experiences. But in the same way that while you're asleep, or even while you're awake, something might happen that you're just not aware of, and it could still make your life go worse. I think the same can be true of death.
But the big difference between sleep and death is that you don't exist when you're dead, and you will never be conscious again. So,
Yes,
if somebody
yes,
sees you in your sleep,
right,
presumably the arrow of causation works so that it could make your
right.
life worse after you wake up, whereas this cannot happen when you're dead.
Right. So as I said, I didn't mean the analogy with sleep to be sort of providing the whole argument. I think that was just meant to motivate the thought that the claim that something doesn't harm you doesn't commit you to the claim that sleep doesn't harm you, but you can be harmed by something that happens while you sleep. Death doesn't harm you, but so that was just meant to motivate the thought that that's not enough to get you the view that you couldn't be harmed after you're dead.
So,
Right. So the
are
problem.
you saying? I'm sorry. Nagel, for example, seems to be of the view that you can be harmed without it ever affecting you. You could be harmed by events outside of our light cone or whatever it's called that
Mhm.
literally could not ever have a causal
Yeah.
influence on you.
Right.
Because if your reputation was besmirched in, parallel universe or whatever. Um, that's not what you're saying. It sounds like you're saying that there has to be some kind of effect on you for you to be harmed.
No, I wasn't saying that. So maybe I should back up a little bit. So this book arose. I think I sort of mentioned this earlier. Like I don't typically get interested in topics per se. I come across arguments. So I was actually in the process of developing a sexual ethics course, and I was trying to find different topics in sexual ethics that might fit into a course. And so I was reading just some sort of surveys, and there was one that was started to talk a bit about necrophilia, and I thought, okay, no, I don't want to talk about
I
necrophilia.
was wondering, surely
Uh,
he
yeah,
can't be getting to necrophilia.
yeah,
This is how,
uh, but but then it just sort of referred in, it was kind of like my experience with Thompson as a TA back in grad school. It referred to this article by George Pitcher and just gave like maybe a 2 paragraph summary of the argument, and I thought like, oh, that actually sounds kind of interesting. And so then I checked out the Pitcher article and kind of read it and reread it and it mulled it over for a couple of weeks. And then, it totally derailed. I had been planning to work on a project on sexual ethics. This was a number of years ago. And now I'm kind of getting back to it now. But in any event, okay. So, but this is relevant to, I guess, what I want to say. So, what I found, so I was not previously interested in posthumous harm. It wasn't at all on my radar. There are, in fact, interesting social issues like posthumous organ donation, posthumous embryo changes and so forth. Anyway, but I just, this argument was interesting. And the reason Pitcher's argument was interesting to me is precisely because he says something about the question that you just asked me that struck me as substantially different from what I had thought defenders of posthumous harm had to say. So you said, well, in the case where you're asleep, there's an existing subject who's being harmed. Let's say if somebody's peeping on them, or at least, we can assume for the sake of the argument that that's a harm to them. But once you're dead, there's no subject. So the traditional response I came to see after I sort of read into this more, right, those who defend posthumous harm in one way or another would try to come up with some remnant of you that still exists after you're dead. Okay. So they'll say something like, well, your biological life might be over, but your biographical life continues, right? Or your reputation still exists, or at least in one version, Feinberg had said, your interests can still exist even after you don't exist, as if there could be these sort of disembodied interests. Okay, so what's distinctive and I found interesting about Pitcher's argument is he doesn't claim that the subject of harm is the corpse, or the pile of ashes. It's not the dead person, right? He claims that the subject of harm is the living, breathing person who existed prior to their death. Okay, and so I found this, puzzling, but I sort of worked it through, and eventually I was convinced. And so, the basic idea is in the simultaneous harm case, like the peeping Tom case, the idea is supposed to be, if you do have the intuition that the person being peeped on is being harmed, even if they're not aware of it, I think the best explanation is going to be something like, at least, uh, that right now they have a desire that not be happening. And the frustration of that desire makes things worse for them, even if they're not aware that the desire is being frustrated. Okay. So that's kind of like the first part of the argument that I try to defend in the book. Anyhow, if you accept that view, then the move from sort of simultaneous harm to backwards caused harm, if you want to look at it that way, right, is that many people, I think most people, also have at least some forward-looking desires about what will happen after their death. Many people have desires about what will become of their remains, their estate. If they were artists who had produced something, they have desires about what will come of them. And then, right, the idea is that if at some point subsequent to a person's death, one of those desires is frustrated, right, the claim is what that means is at the time the person was living, right, they were having a frustrated desire rather than a satisfied desire. So someone maybe thought that they were in the process of successfully completing a project where the project involved something happening after they die. But it turns out during their life, they were unsuccessfully doing that because it turns out that after they die, the project is thwarted, something like that. And yeah, that's the basic idea behind Pitcher's argument. And what I try to do in the book is kind of, somewhat similar to what I did with Thompson. I try to sort of expand on the argument, look at all the objections that have been raised in the literature, try to respond to them.
Yeah, I like your choice of Clifford Still as to begin the book. The fact that he willed that all his art be collected in one place, and of course, wills in general are obviously the phenomenon to press because. If you honestly think that dead people can't be harmed, then why should we follow wills?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so the Clifford Still case, it was very striking. I didn't know any of this until I happened to visit the museum, and it wasn't just that he sort of had these terms in his will, but he was very explicit that, this was kind of his primary motivation for creating his works of art in the first place. Like he was creating them during his life with the idea that they would then be, essentially gathered in one place, posthumously. Yeah, I mean, with respect to Wells, I don't want to deny that there are other kinds of stories we can tell. So, I suspect you could have some kind of rule consequentialist principle, that could do a pretty plausible job of, defending the claim that, society as a whole will go better if we have a practice of honoring these requests. So, I'm not sure that we can't come up with other routes to justify at least some of the practices that involve the dead. So in that sense, my motivation was more like, this is a puzzling claim. This is an interesting claim, but I'm starting to become convinced. And then after a while, I was like, I think I am convinced, and one way to find out for me anyhow, one way to find out if I'm convinced about something is to try to write a book defending it. And if I do, then I think it means I'm convinced.
That's an expensive way in terms of time and energy, but hey, if you've got
Yeah.
the time,
Well, and I'm not convinced of that many things.
that's true. So each one deserves its treatment. Okay, you told
Something
me
like that. Yeah.
you have two more books already just about finished. One on sexual consent and one on AI ethics. Give me the elevator pitch for each.
Okay. Uh, Well, one is closer to being finished than the other. So the sexual consent book is all but finished. I'm taking the fall to make some final revisions in response to some additional feedback. Yeah, so the elevator pitch for that book is well, getting valid consent to sex is important or whatever. There's preliminary stuff that I don't really feel like I need to be part of the pitch. So I guess let's start again. Uh, it's pretty widely recognized that there are three main kinds of things that can invalidate consent. So coercion, incompetence, deception. You can have sort of clear cases in non-sexual contexts where pretty much everyone will agree. Like, yeah, the person said yes to something, but it's not valid consent. You can't act on it because it was clearly coercion, or they're clearly not competent to consent, or they were tricked into signing the document, or whatever. Um, but in each of those three cases, there can be versions of those cases where I think it's less clear what we should say. So, for example, clear paradigmatic cases of coercion. I'm probably already beyond my elevator pitch time limit. Sorry, but
It's a
clear
tall
cases.
building.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And an old elevator. Uh, yeah, clear paradigmatic cases of conversion of coercion involve, a threat to inflict significant physical harm, and so one kind of non-standard case can involve threats to inflict non-physical harm. So A says to B, if you don't have sex with me, I'll reveal an embarrassing secret of yours. Okay, maybe a pretty important secret like that you're cheating on your spouse. Okay, so it's a threat of significant harm, but it's not physical harm. Does that count as consent invalidating coercion? Or again, paradigm cases involve threats of serious harm, right? Many people think it has to be harm so serious that like no reasonable person would resist it or something like that. But you can have cases where the threat is pretty mild. Um, I don't know, I'll pinch you. It'll hurt for a couple of seconds, or I'll cause you like some minor embarrassment or something. And I don't find it obvious that that's not supposed to count as coercion. And then similar things, with incompetence. Again, I guess I'll run the elevator pitch out, but you've got different kinds of cases involving incompetence. And again, I think, like, for example, with intoxication, there are going to be cases where it's clear that someone is too drunk to give valid consent. There are going to be cases where I think it's pretty clear, having a few sips of wine is not enough to invalidate their consent. And it's not as easy as you might think to figure out like what principle to appeal to, to sort of draw the line between them and so forth. So the book is basically a discussion of a series of cases where it's clear at a general level that the kind of thing in question invalidates consent. So again, in general, that coercion can, incompetence can, deception can, but it's not clear what to say about a particular range of cases. And then I try to sort of figure out what the most reasonable conclusions are. The AI ethics book is less far along, but I did just finish teaching a graduate course on the main topic, so I think I at least have my elevator pitch ready. So that is focusing on 4 forms of machine learning that are either, well, in 3 cases already widely used by governments, and in the 4th case are kind of under development for government use. And in each case, they raise, I think, in each case, they raise a number of problems, but for each one, there's really kind of one distinctive moral problem that they raise. And then I sort of have a discussion of each of them. Yeah, I guess I can mention it very briefly. So there's kind of the big data worry that massive scales of AI involve a violation of the right to privacy. So I have a chapter on CCTV-enabled mass public surveillance. And there the focus is on whether mass public surveillance violates the right to privacy. You have these predictive policing algorithms, which are used to help police departments make deployment decisions. These are things that are already very widely in use. They take historical crime data, they spew out predictions about where crimes are most likely to occur, what times of day or night they're most likely to occur. The police then make their deployment decisions in accordance with that. The 3rd chapter is on risk. And then the concern there is the main concern that people have raised that I focus on is various ways in which the algorithms become racially biased. They either they inherit the racial bias of the historical crime data, or they exacerbate the racial bias in various ways. The The third chapter is on risk assessment tools. So these are all sort of data-driven algorithms, actually kind of related to some of the Clockwork Orange stuff we were talking about earlier, I suppose, but making predictions about who's a bigger risk to reoffend, flee from their trial, and this sort of thing. And courts are increasingly using these to make decisions about not just bail and parole, but even sentencing lengths. And the main problem that I focus on there is opacity. So you've got these algorithms that are so complex that, so there was this famous case, well, in the literature anyhow, famous case, Eric Loomis in Wisconsin, so that he's sentenced for a relatively minor crime, gets the maximum sentence, and the judge says part of the reason he's giving him the maximum sentence is because this algorithm, I'm blanking on the name of the algorithm at the moment, said that he was a high risk to reoffend. And the lawyer says, well, we'd like to see why the algorithm thinks this. And in this case, the problem is that the algorithm is proprietary. It's a secret formula of a private company, so the courts don't have the right to look at it. But
Well,
even
then the
if it
court
were,
shouldn't have the right to use it.
well, that's okay. That's what Loomis said, and he lost in court, right? So there, the claim is that the opacity of these algorithms violates what's said to be a right to an explanation. That's the kind of core term that you come across. Okay, so mass public surveillance, predictive policing, risk assessment tools, these are all widely in use to try to address crime in one way or another. And each one has raised like a pretty substantial moral objection. So I will say this tentatively because I haven't finished the book yet, but the way the book is written right now, I end up rejecting all three of those objections, including the right to an explanation objection. You're just asking for the elevator pitch now, so I probably can't give you more than that. But I think it turns out that none of these objections are successful. And then the final chapter is a bit different because it's on autonomous weapon systems, which they're under development, but these sort of killer robots don't really exist right now, and some people think that they really won't. But to the extent that we could develop weapon systems that are autonomous in the sense that they kind of make their own decisions about which targets to engage and how to engage them. And when I say make their own decisions, I mean decisions that are not just pre-programmed into them, but that based on lessons that they've come to on their own as a result of acquiring, information that they acquired on their own, well after their programmers, activated them and so forth. There's this to me at least, very interesting argument to the effect that if we use one of these things and then it kind of goes haywire and decides to like massacre a bunch of innocent civilians, nobody can be held responsible for the deaths of these innocent civilians. So Robert Sparrow has maybe the best known article, I think maybe in all of the AI ethics literature now, called Killer Robots. And in that chapter, I argue against that objection too. And so my conclusion...
You're fine with the coming dystopia. You welcome
Well,
our robot overlords.
Yes. Well, so actually the working title is not 3 cheers, but 2. Okay. So 2 cheers for our new robot overlords. AI ethics in the state or something like this. But right, I mean, what I want to do in the book, and I realize this is now a very long elevator we're riding, I want to just set aside all the empirical objections. Just assume these algorithms would reduce crime a bit, or assume that these autonomous weapon systems would at least somewhat reduce civilian casualties and so forth. And I just want to look at whether these particular moral objections are satisfactory objections. And again, it's a work in progress, so maybe don't quote me quite yet, but I'm on track to be defending the view that in all 4 cases, the empirical stuff might not work out, but if it does, it's okay for the state to do all this stuff. I find myself as surprised as you look, and I definitely had that experience teaching this material this last semester. I will say, I'm sure the elevator has already landed at this point, but I think of myself as someone who has very strong kind of civil libertarian instincts. And so I think of myself as someone who ought to be pretty predisposed to accept all these objections. and yet I find, when I think about them, I'm not. So,
Well, somebody needs to come up with one that convinces you.
yeah, I mean, that's one way to look at it. I mean, yeah, or it's possible that there's a lot of sort of hysteria over this stuff. It's weird, I have to say, as I get older now, I mean, I feel like this is the one area where I would have expected younger people to be, whatever, they've grown up, they're digitally literate and all this sort of thing. I would have expected maybe younger people to be more sympathetic to, we're already using computers for all these things. What's the big deal about using, and then it'd be the old fogies that'd be like, this is totally unacceptable. But yeah, at least so far, my students, I think, are generally much more resistant to all this
Well, but then
than
it's the old people who have been using Facebook and are totally fine with, and they're the all.
yeah,
It's old people who have
yeah,
Alexas and these smart speakers because it's easy. Whereas the young people would say, "Hell no, Zuckerberg's not getting my information."
yeah, yeah. Although it's interesting, I will mention that in the case of the mass public surveillance, one of the reasons I was interested in this is because I can remember having this discussion even when I was, yeah, like a college student. So I was a young person talking with I was visiting a friend in New York City, and he's also very civil libertarian or whatever, and we somehow got into some discussion about whether it would be okay if they required you to, like, if the cops could inspect your backpack before you walked into Central Park or something, and he thought it was just sort of obvious that that would be like totally unacceptable, like, it's public property, like anybody can go
Mm.
there, whatever. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I can remember all these years back, and this was partly what motivated me to take on this topic now, is like thinking, like, I just didn't find that so obvious. Like, I have the right to walk into this park without proving that there's not a bomb in my backpack. I don't know. So some of the stuff, I think even young people, at least for me, even as a young person, I think I would have been skeptical of. But who knows?
Um, uh, Regarding the consent thing, I seem to recall that Hobbes, to tie it back to your dissertation, Hobbes
Oh my
had a
God.
very loose notion of consent. Like if isn't he the one who says if you're held at gunpoint and you consent to give someone your purse, then that consent is binding?
Uh, is it okay if I admit that I don't remember?
That's fine. Yeah, no,
It's not.
and
It
I
certainly sounds like the kind of thing he would have said. Um,
it's also if you
yeah.
look at I wrote my dissertation on the social contract, and I remember thinking if you look at a lot of fairy stories, there's binding consent in like the story of Rumpelstiltskin. It's ridiculous that you could consent to these kind of things and that it would be a
Ah,
binding consent.
interesting.
And
Yeah.
in
I mean,
fact,
I suppose.
I argued at one point, and Sharon Lloyd did not go for this, that a Lockean social contract just wouldn't work because the kind of circumstances you're in the state of nature, no consent would ever be binding. Well,
Right, right. I was seeing how the argument could go there. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so not sure if I can pull this off the top of my head, but one of the cases I am talking about in the sexual consent book involves so-called third-party coercion. So there's like an interesting little literature. It was kind of stagnant for a while, but the last year or two, there's been a little bit of a revival. But these are cases where A threatens to harm B unless B gives consent to C to do something. So, like an example to tie it back to the abortion case could be um, the boyfriend threatens the girlfriend and says, I will beat you up unless you go get an abortion. But of course, to get an abortion, she has to give consent to the abortion provider to provide the abortion, right? So A threatens B into giving consent to C. Picture a case where the abortion provider knows that the only reason the woman is consenting is because her boyfriend will beat her up if she doesn't consent. But suppose like she refuses to tell the abortion provider who the boyfriend is. There's no way for the abortion provider to prevent this and so forth. The question in the literature on third-party coercion is whether, even though two-party coercion uncontroversially invalidates consent, whether three-party coercion might nonetheless not invalidate consent. And in that section, I do end up defending the view that it doesn't invalidate consent. Again, somewhat surprising view that I initially became convinced of by reading, as far as I can tell, an almost completely uncited 4-page medical journal article from like the 1980s. Again, you probably don't have time for the details here, but in any event, although I may not be able to spin this out off the top of my head, it seems to me that that might be relevant to the issue you're raising. So if one holds the view that I'm defending, that third-party coercion does not invalidate consent, yeah, then I think it could turn out that if the only reason I can, let's say you're the sovereign, and the only reason I give you my consent to obey you is because someone else is threatening to kill me, and this is the only way that I can avoid that. I don't know. I think maybe then I would be committed to the view that that could be valid consent. I'd have to think a bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, you've got more books in you, clearly. Always more books.
At least those two. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, David. That was very fun, and you clearly are not afraid of being a contrarian. You go where the argument leads.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a pleasure. And yeah, I know the contrarian thing. I guess I will say, when I wrote A Defense of Abortion, I felt good about that book. I thought I had done a nice job. There was, in a sense, I mean, obviously, it's a contentious issue. Obviously, many people disagree. But, in the world that I inhabit, the world of academia and so forth, you know, vast majority of people are pro-choice, and many of them kind of almost unreflexively. And so, yeah, I think to some extent it was a little bit less rewarding because the people in my world, it wasn't so clear that many people really felt like, do we need a whole book defending this? Like, whatever. So yeah, there has been, I don't feel that I'm deliberately contrarian, but there has been something rewarding about finding arguments where this seems right to me, and then seeing it's not just that there are like other people out there that don't agree, but that there are like plenty of people within academic philosophy who don't agree.
It's a good way to get cited a lot, that's for sure. Because
yeah,
everybody wants to write a reply to you because they say, "Oh,
uh-huh.
I hate that argument."
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's working well for David. But I don't view myself as in David Benatar's league, contrarian wise.
Or
But yeah, aspirational. Yeah.
or what's his name? The Don Marquis.
Well,
Don Marquis,
oh,
another one.
oh, I thought you were going to say Stephen Kirshner. That's a whole nother level of contrary, I think. But yeah.